Students are every time I teach teach about the Three-Fifths Compromise, about the role of slavery in the Constitution. Students are always taken by surprise by the Three-Fifths Compromise because it's the wrong states in their mind. It's the wrong states that are on either side of the Three-Fifths Compromise. Let me try to explain. The federal Constitution recognized slavery. First, it stated that runaway slaves throughout the United States must be returned to their masters. Number one. Second recognition of slavery is that the Constitution states that stated that in order to compute the number of representatives that each state would have in the House of Representatives, 3/5 of the enslaved inhabitants in each state would be counted alongside the citizens of that state, of those states. This kind of census, an official counting of the population, was not necessary beforehand because under the previous American Constitution, the Articles of Confederation, states received equal representation in Congress regardless of the size of the population. The new Constitution, the federal Constitution, retained equal representation for all states in the upper chamber, meaning in the Senate, in upper chamber of Congress, in the Senate of the United States, but it called for proportional representation in the lower chamber, in the House of Representatives. And that's why you need to count the population to see what proportion of representation this population would need compared to a different size population in another state. So what surprises students about the Three-Fifths Compromise, about how the two sides lined up on it in support and in opposition, what surprises them is that it was the southern states that advocated counting all the slaves for the census. But eventually, the South compromised on counting only 3/5 of them. Okay. But by contrast, the North pushed for counting none of the slaves, 0 of the slaves for the census. So the reason it surprises many people, many students, many people, is that most Americans have been taught to look at the Three-Fifths Compromise as some sort of a philosophical statement on the value of Black and white people. Okay, as a declaration by Congress that a Black person has 3/5 of the value of a white person, and that's why we're only going to count 3/5 of them. So within this incorrect conception of the Three-Fifths Compromise, students expect that the slave states, because they think of it as a philosophical statement on the value of Black people, students expect that slave states would set the value of slave lives at 0, or of Black lives at 0, so don't count any slaves, and that the free states in the North would push for counting all the slaves because they saw them as equal in their humanity to white citizens, meaning that they deserved liberty. The way to fix this to address this confusion or solve this conundrum is to remind oneself that the Three-Fifths Compromise, just like the rest of the Constitution, is not an exercise in moral philosophy. Rather, the Constitution was a practical mechanism for 13 separate states to share power and share resources in the central government. Okay, to form a central government that shares power and shares resources across 13 states with different needs, different sizes, different circumstances. And so in this context, practical, pragmatic, power-sharing arrangement, the Three-Fifths Compromise emerges as a compromise between southern slave states, which naturally wanted to boost their power, their representative power, their weight in the proportional chamber of Congress, in the House of Representatives, and northern states that wanted to prevent this. Okay? Southern states had fewer citizens than northern states in 1787, when the new Constitution was being hammered out in Philadelphia. And this population imbalance between the South and the North would continue to grow thereafter. And they were aware of the fact that more immigration and that the birth rate and the immigration rate into the northern states was greater than to the southern states. So they knew that the North would become demographically and therefore representationally stronger over time. So because the proposed federal constitution established that each state's delegation in the House of Representatives would be in proportion to the size of its population, it was clear to everyone that the northern states would have a clear, permanent, and growing majority in Congress, in the House of Representatives. And this would allow northern states with a robust commercial and manufacturing sectors, and an agricultural sector that mostly served the domestic market, these northern states would be able to influence economic policy and trade policies in ways that were favorable to their economies and unfavorable to the southern economies, which were heavily agricultural and geared more for export and international markets. So Southern framers of the the Southern delegates in the Constitutional Convention recognized that including slaves in the census would enable the Southern states to send more delegates to the House of Representatives, okay? Because they had few, compared to the Northern states, the Southern states had few citizens, but many slaves, whereas the Northern states had many citizens and relatively few slaves. So therefore, the Southern states recommended counting all the slaves. Okay? In Northern states, not being dummies, Northern states objected, stating that slaves should not be counted at all because they were not citizens of the Southern states, and therefore not citizens of the United States of America. Okay? Because the idea was at the time, and still is today for us, that legislatures represent citizens only. Okay? And the Northern states pointed out, additionally, that because Southern congressmen will not be representing and serving their slave populations, because those slaves are not voting for them, they're not constituents, therefore, each Southern citizen would have greater representation than a Northern citizen, which violates the principle of proportional representation in the House of Representatives. Yeah, because in a proportional system, every citizen, a citizen of North Carolina to a citizen of New York, should have equal power and equal claim, equal weight in the House of Representatives. So the Southern states wanted to boost their numbers by counting slaves. Northern states wanted to prevent this and argued that no slaves should be counted. But in the interest of agreement, Northern and Southern delegates in the Philadelphia Convention agreed to basically split the difference almost down the middle and count, you want to count all of them, we want to count none of them. Let's split it roughly down the middle, and we'll count 3/5 of them. Okay, we'll count 3/5 of the slaves in a given state for the purpose of the census. Of course, the free Black population was counted fully in both the North and the South, alongside other free residents. Um, and this reveals that the Three-Fifths Compromise was not a philosophical statement on the relative value of and relative humanity of blacks and whites. Okay? It was merely a mathematical compromise on whether slaves should be counted in the census. Okay? Most whites in both North and South certainly had a very low opinion of African Americans, but this particular compromise does not measure these views. Okay? It doesn't mean that Americans thought that Black people were three-fifths the value, the worth of a white person. Okay? I'm sure many Americans, probably most, felt that it was much lower than that. Okay, but this was not a philosophical discussion. It was simply horse trading. You want to count them all, we want to count none of them, split the difference. So what this compromise does gauge, okay, it does not gauge Americans' philosophical position on the value of white people versus Black people. What it does gauge was local populations' concerns about losing their ability to govern themselves locally and shape their own economies. Because in the decentralized British Empire, different colonies could manage their affairs and their economies differently, right? To each his own. The same was true in the decentralized United States under the Articles of Confederation. Okay, it was a states' rights republic. Every state retained its own sovereignty and its own arrangements, again, to each his own. But with the transition from the first Constitution, from the Articles of Confederation, to the second Constitution, the Federal Constitution, that freedom of every state to run its own affairs locally, according to local custom, local circumstances, and local interests, came under threat. Okay? Because the Federal Constitution empowered outsiders, empowered other states through the national government to manage things that up until then were always handled locally by the local government, local legislature, local governors, etc. So such bureaucratic centralization, which is what the Federal Constitution proposed, this kind of administrative centralization was what American settlers had feared and resisted since the colony's early history. Okay, this fear had produced the Glorious Revolution in America in the 1680s. This fear produced the Americans' rejection of the Albany Congress, or the Albany Plan, in 1754. It produced the colonial resistance against Britain in the 1760s and 70s. And of course, it produced the American Revolution in 1775. And this fear, this mindset, was then articulated and cemented in the first American Constitution, the Articles of Confederation. Okay, this fear that outsiders would shape how we manage our affairs locally here, how we govern ourselves. It was the same fear that produced the federal constitution's four most famous compromises: the Connecticut Compromise, the Electoral College Compromise, the Three-Fifths Compromise, and of course, the Bill of Rights.